I will start talking about today's lecture, reading a definition. The definition of what is a double agent. And it says a double agent is a counterintelligence term for someone who pretends to spy on a target organization on behalf of a controlling organization, but in fact is loyal to the target organization. However, today's lecture, Utopia's Ghost, Postmodernism Reconsidered, and its lecturer, Reinhold Martin, require perhaps of a much more complex definition than a double agent. Perhaps we need a triple agent or perhaps a quadruple agent. And of course, we would say that he definitely is active in the counterintelligence of some critical, post-critical, and projective practices, with its critical of what towards a utopian realism that we actually have, some of us read in our seminar just 2 weeks ago. Reinhold actually looks to architecture's history, perhaps, on the name of Utopia. But don't confuse me, his loyalty is not to Utopia, and it is not to the history of architecture as such. His loyalty is perhaps to something more fuzzy, to something that perhaps is just a specter, and it is the ghost of Utopia, because Utopia, with all its academies of Utopia, it is not that what perhaps we have inherited as such. So, Reinhold Martin, in this kind of gasbuster race towards a new history of architecture, towards a new disciplinary ground from where to think architecture, even if full with chains and white blankets, we would say, is somehow operating in different realms as a good double or triple or quadruple agent. He's an associate professor of architecture at the Graduate School of Architecture at Planning and Preservation at Columbia University, where he actually directs the PhD program and is the director of the Wells Center. He is a founding co-editor of the journal Grey Room, a partner in the firm of Martin Baxi Architects, where they actually think that they can really change the world, what I think is very interesting, and has published widely on the history and theory of modern and contemporary architecture. Of course, he's a pedagogical agent, he is a practicing agent, he is a publishing agent, and with all these roles, one might feel exhausted, but books still come out. So Martin is the author of the organizational complex, Architecture, Media, and Corporate Space, with SOM and all these people. I think it's a nice place for a nice spy. Anyway, published by MIT in 2003. He's co-author with Kadambari Baxi of Entropia in 2001, and Multinational City, Architectural Itineraries in Actar in the year 2007. He's currently working on a book that re-theorizes postmodernism, I believe, that with the title of today's lecture. But of course, I'm still not a double agent or a triple agent, but I also have my sources. So I have asked, what is the last thing that Reinhold is actually doing? And someone told me that he's looking into the architecture of Enlightenment, but the American Enlightenment. And that, in a certain way, is a history from Jefferson to Buckminster Fuller. So, however, one might think that this triple agent just must be trying to create, like in an enigmatic process, some small histories from postmodernism to Enlightenment to here and there. I would say perhaps that we are here having someone that tries to create a certain other history of American architecture. So, indeed, utopias and how to think them differently, this is going to be a lecture that I hope you all of us enjoy. Please join me welcoming Reinhold Martin.
Thank you, Eva. I'm not sure that I'll be able to live up to that. I'll try. I don't know how many agents are in the room, but we'll find out, I suppose. And thank you for having me and for coming. I will, just to warn you about a couple of things, about why one would even use the term postmodernism today. The subtitle of this lecture and its primary subject is what we used to call postmodernism. And it seems to me that it has to do with the sense that it's either too early or too late to speak about this. In a sense, to historicize it, as you're saying, but also to contemplate its ongoing sort of presence. And that's sort of the sort of spirit, if you could say, in which most of what I have to say this evening is sort of framed. Things being a little bit out of sync, out of joint, that's sort of what ghosts do. They show up when they're not supposed to be there. So that's at least my excuse for using the term and for sort of inflicting the images on you that I will. The other reasons are pedagogical to a certain extent, as well as theoretical, that I, for the last couple of years at Columbia, have taught a seminar on the subject, and last year we had the privilege of collaborating with our friends at the Canadian Centre for Architecture, the CCA, using their collections. And you may know that the CCA is a kind of headquarters for, sort of archiving postmodernism in architecture. And so we mounted a little exhibition that has been traveling around. It was at Montreal, then it was in New York, called Utopia's Ghost, that tried to kind of discern something like the traces of utopian unconscious within so-called postmodernism. That was done in collaboration with the students, and I have to say learned a lot from these dialogues, particularly with people who, probably like yourselves, didn't, as it were, grow up with this work and weren't entirely conditioned by it one way or the other. Because it used to be you were either on this team or you were on another team. Or maybe there are a few teams in between or in the middle of it all, but it was very, very polemical. Anyway, so the other sort of context in which to think this problem, which might be a little bit more immediate in a sense, has to do with the contemporary city. I'm not going to say much, if anything, about the city as such, or global cities or otherwise. These two buildings were designed by somebody who graduated from Columbia School of Architecture in the 1970s. He's the most famous architect in India. Maybe you know him. His name is Hafiz Contractor, and he built this entire city, more or less, which is a city called Gurgaon, just outside of New Delhi. And much of the work that I'm going to show you, as he confessed to me when I talked about this with him, was the kind of stuff they were doing at Columbia and other schools, Rice no doubt as well, in the 1970s and 80s, when architects like Hafiz were formed. So, for whatever it's worth, it's still there, being built in some kind of way, shape, or form. In any event, the postmodern city is also generally understood as a kind of diffuse and disorienting place, and some of that is running in the background as well, as in the sense of a kind of effort, not only to kind of to as it were, grasp what it is that we're dealing with in postmodernism or late capitalism or whatever we want to call this, but also to look for strategies, intellectual strategies mainly, ways of thinking to deal with it, and deal with it critically. So toward that end, I'm going to apologize in advance for something like a theoretical prelude that might run a bit dense, but so be it. And then we're going to look at some architecture. So if you'll bear with me through the sort of step-by-step introduction to the essentially the thesis, which is really the thesis of the book from which this is excerpted. So think. By 1915. This word had already become a corporate command. This is Tom Watson Sr. at IBM. And by 1940, as the official slogan of IBM, it announced the formalization of what would eventually come to be known by the early 1970s as immaterial or post-industrial production, service economy, the thing that collapsed last fall. In 1997, in belated recognition of the long-standing incorporation of a humanist ethos, in other words, the incorporation of thought, human thought itself, as an affective engine driving this neoliberal or global economy, this command was translated by IBM's competitor, Apple Computer, into Think Different. So the machine is in effect replaced by the human. It's sort of an interesting twist. This rather abject state of affairs to which these statements belong has since acquired a variety of names. In 1973, Daniel Bell, the neoconservative social theorist Daniel Bell, had already described it rather optimistically as the coming of post-industrial society. In the late 1980s, Gilles Deleuze called it the society of control. More recently, the philosopher Alain Badiou has called it the second restoration, the first being the post-revolutionary, post-Napoleonic one. And in a related Deleuze-Foucauldian vein, Antonio Negri and Michael Hart have called it empire. But the term that continues to haunt all of these others, whether as a symptom, a consequence, or a precursor, is the one that was favored by thinkers like Jean-François Lyotard, Frederick Jameson, David Harvey, and many others during the 1980s and early 1990s. Simply postmodernism. Sorry. So my purpose in revisiting what we in architecture call postmodernism is therefore not to reclaim this term from its subsequent fate. I'm not advocating for a postmodernist revival, but to consider its initial assumptions. In that sense, the project from which this talk is excerpted is not a history of postmodernism, but really a retheorization based, or reinterpretation based on historical evidence of some of its major themes. It's an attempt to think what can be called a properly architectural thought, and thereby to propose an agenda for architectural discourse and scholarship at a moment when the architecture conventionally understood as postmodern as fast becoming an object of PhD dissertations and other primary historical research. And you know, you have to, we're really going to work with sort of the conventional, whatever the sort of conventional wisdom is about what postmodern means in architecture. I'm not going to try to redefine it for you, really. I'm just going to take for granted that there is a kind of consensus about what kind of architecture we're talking about. And so, running in the background of my presentation here are questions concerning periodization, disciplinary knowledge, and historical change. These are the sort of technical historical questions. These and other historiographical questions are made all the more urgent, however, by the fact that now, as then, they are further complicated by the ever-expanding and structurally contested frames of reference that we sometimes attempt to name with the term globalization. This has not really been recognized as much in architecture, but it's been basically a kind of working fundamental assumption of postmodernist theory since the 80s, that what we call globalization is coincident with postmodernist or postmodernity. We're just, in a sense, using a different term. As some of you may recall, a number of early attempts to map the contours of what Frederick Jameson has called postmodernism, or the cultural logic of late capitalism, presuppose the existence of a postmodern architecture, the properties of which were frequently invoked as a model or a paradigm for cultural postmodernism more generally. Revisiting the conceptual and terminological ruins left behind by this discourse means, therefore, turning the tables on architecture's supposedly symptomatic status as the ultimate postmodern art form. This is not to say that something like a postmodern architecture never existed. Rather, I propose something like a kind of interpretive détournement, a defamiliarization of so-called postmodern architecture and its discourses that rereads them against the grain, deliberately getting it wrong, in a sense. Not in some perverse attempt to resurrect or recuperate this architecture, but in order to conjure the ghost of something that postmodernism itself has long been thought to have killed off. That vexed figure of historical redemption that we still call Utopia. Now, unlike many other more typically Marxian analyses of postmodernism, such as Jameson, for example, the theoretical perspective that I adopt is broadly, if somewhat unconventionally, biopolitical. That is, I understand architectural postmodernism as a discourse, in the sort of Foucauldian sense, rather than as an ideology or a style. A discourse that maps onto and interacts with other discourses, all of which aggregate into a heterogeneous matrix that's dedicated to what Michel Foucault called the care of the self, or more pointedly, what can be called the production of life as a category of knowledge and of practice. This is a way of naming what's happening with the return of humanism in postmodernism. A return to the category of life as a problem for architecture. In postmodernism, this takes the form of a thoroughgoing neo-humanism in which architecture has participated at many levels. The level on which I want to concentrate this evening involves the attendant inability to think the possibility of a better life, which is to say, to think a properly utopian thought. This is, I think, if there is a definition of contemporary architecture today, of today's architecture, it's essentially that, the unthinkability of utopia. Meaning a better and more just way of being with others, rather than merely a more humane way of perpetuating the status quo and its inherent violence. Elements of this possibility, such a possibility, had been figured in the many and diverse modern utopianisms, of course, including modernism's famously anti-humanist currents, prior to their neutralization within today's neoliberal consensus. In that sense, the figure of utopia runs through my analysis not so much as an ideological phantasm, as it did, for example, for Manfredo Tafuri, but as a kind of discursive construction, a sort of technical invention that seems to have been rendered obsolete by the transition to postmodernism. Utopia's ghost, therefore, is the name that I give to the historical afterlife of this construction. And it's precisely this half-alive, half-dead status of the ghost, in other words, its inhumanity, that I propose to understand in biopolitical terms. So, okay. We begin in Venice, circa 1980. A specter is roaming through Europe, the postmodern. This is how the Italian architect and critic Paolo Portoghese introduced his book on postmodernism in architecture. This is the first sentence of his book, and it's in quotes. A specter is roaming through Europe, the postmodern. The subtitle of the book was The Architecture of the Post-Industrial Society, and it was published in Italian in 1982 and in English in 1983. Portoghese's introductory sentence was actually, and somewhat uncannily, a double quotation. It was, in fact, the title of an article that was published in Le Monde, the French newspaper, on the occasion of the traveling exhibition known as La Strada Novissima, or the New Street. An important document in the production of the postmodern imaginary, La Strada Novissima was a full-scale, multi-architect street, quote-unquote street, that was replete with historical quotations. It served as the centerpiece of the first architecture biennale in Venice in 1980, which was curated by Portoghese and later traveled to both Paris and San Francisco. This is the Parisian installation. There we are in San Francisco. So it originates in, this is the 1980 Biennale, and then it goes on the road. But of course, the Le Monde headline was also itself a historical quotation, or really a paraphrase, of one of the most important lines of one of the most important documents that modernity had produced. The oft-citing opening line of the Communist Manifesto, which was translated into English with the approval of Engels as follows: "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." So Portoghese is paraphrasing this: "A specter is roaming through Europe, the postmodern." The stated theme of the 1980 Biennale, the presence of the past, was intended to evoke a burgeoning interest in historical citation on the part of architects on both sides of the Atlantic, as well as in Japan. If by the early 1950s, a hegemonic international modernism, expressed by such enigmas as functionalism, was thought to have relegated architectural styles like Beaux-Arts classicism to the dustbin of history, this was the story, basically. Modernism killed this off. Then, by 1980, modernism was thought by many to belong to that same dustbin, with its utopian aspects reduced to historical curiosities, if not Faustian nightmares. And so in Venice, the presence of the past, this is the poster for the show, referred to the proclivity among architects to scavenge history's dustbin for obsolescent languages and styles, sometimes earnestly and sometimes irreverently, but always against the prohibitions enforced by modernist dogma. Needless to say, neither the Strada Novissima nor any other such manifestation of such tendencies succeeded in restoring the historical past to full presence in architectural terms. These aren't actual copies. Arguably, this was never the intention in the first place, though certainly many claims were made on behalf of a return to past architectures for their restorative moral capacities, especially in the face of the traumas visited upon both urban form and civic representation by the rigors of functionalism and associated doctrines. Still, the 1980 Biennale's historicism emphatically did not result in a simple resurrection of historical styles. Instead, visitors were presented with a cacophony of pseudo-events, pseudo-restorations, and pseudo-revivals. In a word, pastiche. In his, this is of course the Venturi, Rauch and Scott Brown facade in this street that was made up of these various facades, designed by different architects, with exhibitions of their work on the inside. So in his important 1991 book on postmodernism, Frederick Jameson describes postmodernist pastiche in architecture and elsewhere, including literature, as, quote unquote, speech in a dead language. That speech, that is stripped of the vital force of modernist parody, in whose ironies critical spirit might otherwise have lived, and as for example in Dada. But with dead languages also come ghosts, especially when that death occurs in Venice. A specter is haunting Europe indeed. More recently, Marx and Engels' famous line provided a subtext for Jacques Derrida's 1994 Specters of Marx, in which Derrida conjures the various undead spirits of German idealism that haunt Marx's historical materialism, while at the same time conjuring the spirits of Marx and Marxism that neoliberalism, especially after 1989, claimed finally to have exorcised. So running through all of this is like what happened to the left, essentially. And this figure of the specter, the ghost, is one that Derrida introduces to account for the fate of Marxism and socialism and so on, particularly in Europe. Derrida calls this logic of haunting a hauntology, as distinct from an ontology. To illustrate, he begins with a reading of Hamlet, concentrating not on the characters but on the stage props. Stage props. In this case, the suit of armor in which the father's ghost appears or seems to appear on stage, his face concealed by the helmet's visor. Derrida calls this the visor effect, in which a specter appears indirectly through its concealment under a visor, as a stage prop, that is, and looks at us. So, ghosts don't usually show up directly. You don't usually see them directly. You see them indirectly. Now, with the scenographic stage set qualities of the Strada Novissima in view, and noting indeed that its facades were actually constructed in the Italian cinematic dream factory Cinecittà, what I hope to do this evening is to make visible, indirectly, the specters of Utopia, as they stare us in the face through the visor of architectural postmodernism. For, in addition to having supposedly killed off various modernisms, postmodern architecture in its various forms also encapsulates the end of history endgame that claims finally to have laid the spirit of Marx and of Marxism to rest. So much so that in architectural discourse, the critic Charles Jenks felt himself qualified to give to this end, which was also the end of what Tafuri had called the dialectic of the avant-gardes, or of revolutionary destruction followed by normative appropriation. Jenks gave this end of modernism essentially, an exact date and time, 3:32 p.m. on July 15th, 1972. That's when it ended. This was the moment when, almost 30 years before the destruction of the World Trade Center and the millennial end of history endgame that event has precipitated, another major work of architecture by the Japanese-American architect Minoru Yamasaki was blown up. The Pruitt-Igoe housing complex in St. Louis. The ironies of this are extraordinary. Yamasaki, he was finishing the World Trade Center as this was being demolished. In case you needed to be reminded that, again, we're speaking of life and death here, Jenks, in his influential 1977 book, The Language of Postmodern Architecture, recorded the controlled demolition of Pruitt-Igoe as marking what he called the death of modern architecture. And you're familiar with this narrative one way or the other. These images, and many like them, circulate in all kinds of directions. There are many things that can be said about the many other disparate architectural events recorded in books like those published by Portuguese and Jenks, exhibited in venues like the 1980 Biennale, and subsequently referenced in surveys of corresponding developments across the arts by critics like Jameson, Andreas Huyssen, Sela Ben Habib, and others. But the one on which I want to concentrate here is the narrative that claims that the utopian aspirations of modernism, visible in all their violent contradiction in public housing projects like Pruitt-Igoe, were killed off for good with the demolition of such projects. This is a neo-humanist meta-narrative which now seems permanently installed, for example, in the form of legislative mandate in post-Katrina New Orleans. In other words, it's the housing projects. Don't you know that? Against this backdrop, I want simply to ask whether the ghost of utopia can nevertheless be seen to haunt the halls of postmodern architecture, even or especially in its most officially sanctioned manifestations. Why? Because today, at a moment when there also seems increasingly less likelihood of an exit from the postmodern hall of mirrors that we call globalization, as practiced by transnational corporations, empire-building nations, and even well-meaning NGOs, there can be no more urgent task than to learn to live with utopia once again. And this goes double for the moment that we're living through right now. Or more precisely, there can be no more urgent task than, to paraphrase Derrida, that of learning to live with utopia's ghost, which is another way of saying to begin the hard work of learning precisely to think again that, in a favorite slogan of the new social movements, another world is possible. For, as Jameson never tires of reminding us, among the hallmarks of a generalized postmodernism amounts to a failure even to conceive the possibility of radical historical change, let alone to realize it. The great majority of modern and proto-modern utopian architectural propositions, from Ledoux to Le Corbusier, have entailed making a picture of an idealized world, a project, that is, and then launching it like a projectile into the future. Oddly enough, the entry of this utopian image into the real, its moment of impact, as it were, necessarily marks the millennial or apocalyptic end of history, in the sense of an ongoing historical dialectic or process. When and if utopia actually arrives, it's all over. This is a reason that you might want to stick with the ghost. Postmodernism and modernism thus share an affinity with the end of history endgame, though they approach it from opposite directions. Modernism, through the often destructive messianic realization of redemptive meta-narratives, whether utopian or otherwise, and postmodernism through the apparent exhaustion of all such narratives, which now seem to have broken up into 1,000 little stories. Take a look at this chart. It's a sort of fake timeline, a faux historical timeline that was included by Charles Jenks in the language of postmodern architecture. He's been reproducing this chart for decades now. It's in every book he publishes in one way or the other. The teleological from-to narratives of the modernist avant-gardes, from this to that, conditioned by a Hegelian zeitgeist, have been replaced here with an image of architectural history going nowhere in particular. Instead, we find what he calls an evolutionary tree branching out into a pointless ecology of architectural styles. I don't know if you can read them, but there's every possible style that you can imagine up there. This tree is organized around a series of image-based feedback loops tending towards the entropy of what Jenks calls radical eclecticism. That's the sort of end point of this whole operation. A kind of pluralistic equilibrium in which everything is different from everything else and is therefore the same. Think different. To this day, Jenks continues to insist on the emergence of discernible patterns out of this media ecological soup in the form of secondary formations or groupings. But these two are going nowhere in particular, emerging from the soup only to disappear back into it, to be replaced by new and equally meaningless groupings ad infinitum, in a kind of dynamic, swirling stasis, round and around. So where could the utopian spirit of decisive historical change possibly be found here, except as one irrelevant little story among many, a kind of style, if you like? To explore this question, and thereby to conduct what amounts to a seance dedicated to conjuring utopia's ghost, I want to take a closer look at the architecture of postmodernism itself, which I think can be found the trace or after-image of modernist utopias. These can be sorted into at least 5 architectural figures. This is what we actually did in the exhibition. 5 categories of utopia. Islands, linguistic babble. That's Professor Dean Stern, and that's Professor Graves. Inhuman scale. Worlds within worlds. And roads to nowhere. To begin with, I want to track this last figure, roads to nowhere. This is a Sterling project, the Derby Civic Center project. a sense of going nowhere, a kind of exhausted dynamism, which is pretty much what I've been talking about, in its most literal form possible. I want to trace this to in a sense, its origin. What the Congrès International de l'Architecture Moderne, or SIAM, simply called circulation. So, circulation. Here I remind you of the figural role played by the Promenade Architecturale in the work of an architect like Le Corbusier, the architectural promenade. In the Villa Savoie at Poissy, for example, the passage through the building, I suppose, is this? No. The passage, you can see the passage through the building, was no mere functionalist means of getting from the bottom to the top. Instead, the cinematic ramp, you can see it, zigzagging up, captures the very sense of historical progress to which I've been alluding, as it weaves upward through the building's various functional zones, and lands dramatically on the roof. This, of course, isn't the roof. This is one of the intermediate levels, where the user is presented with a framed view of the pastoral landscape in which the Corbusian machine habitée has decisively landed. The ramp, in other words, succinctly summarizes what we can call a Corbusian teleology, a sort of progress, a sense of progress, going from one place, one world to another, in a sense. In the form of a space-time vector leading inexorably toward the mechanico-Arcadian future that's captured in great detail by the Swiss architect's utopian master plans of the same period. Now, I just ask you to compare this sense of purpose, allegorized in a linear circulation system, with the equally classical, and we can say equally Corbusian, Promenade Architecturale, passing through the Neue Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart, that's designed by James Stirling and completed in 1983. This is a little sketch from the CCA collection, which has Stirling's papers. Widely considered a key monument of postmodernism, this architectural icon was added to a post-industrial city, Stuttgart, in part to generate tourism, and so must also be considered a precursor to Frank Gehry's Guggenheim in Bilbao. But in Stuttgart, in what was then West Germany, entrance to the architectural design competition won by Stirling's office had to contend with the geopolitical requirement to include what was called a democratic path. And this is the beginning of it. You can see it traced up with the handrail. A democratic path, or a public passage, that was commonly required through the site of major West German civic institutions. In these waning days of the Cold War, this path was not required to lead the pedestrian anywhere in particular, except to the degree that it led toward all that was ambiguously Western and democratic about West Germany. Thus its presence, and with it the sense of accessibility and approachability generously accommodated by Stirling's scheme, declared between its lines that whatever could be said of West German public institutions, they were emphatically not of the East, as in East Germany and East Berlin, and the authoritarian overtones carried by those locales. So follow the path through Stirling's building. Here's his drawing of it. Where does it lead? Zigzagging through a series of layers, you see them here, it reaches no climax. Here's the plan. So we were looking like that. Instead, it stages a passage with no end, just from one side of the building to the other with no real destination. Sliding across the forecourt, establishing an axis only to displace it, skirting around the metaphysical central void here, going around this, and leaking out the back, just sort of dribbling out the back, with a tangential escape into the museum itself near the front. This is the actual entrance into the museum. In contrast to the informality of this entry sequence, and this is one of Stirling's many, here it is again, one of Stirling's many playful juxtapositions in this building. The galleries consist of discrete rooms. This is the gallery level. Arranged en filade in a 19th century manner, rather than the drifting loft-like expanses that are characteristic of many 20th century museum interiors. So there's a play with this kind of casual circulation and then this very formal arrangement of rooms. The ambiguous anticlimax of Stirling's promenade in Stuttgart can be compared with that of another museum designed but not built, this time in 1975, for another West German city. I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that? This is the entry submitted by the German architect Oswald Matthias Ungers to a competition in which Stirling also participated for the Wallraf-Richardt Museum in Cologne. The Ungers project, situated on the riverbank adjacent to the cathedral and flanked by the train station, you can see all the elements here, attempts to reconcile these disparate urban elements by inserting a comprehensive gridded matrix of infrastructure. These are the plans, and as you can see, the whole thing kind of emerges out of a grid underground, out of which emerges the various components of the museum. An apparently direct entry sequence is cut into this matrix. You can see it on the lower left. I'll show you a better image in a second. In the form of a linear axis that begins at the plaza surrounding the cathedral, extends onto an above-grade terrace, and then descends onto a dock on the river. The axis is another instance of this democratic path, passing from public plaza to public waterfront. But it's also something else entirely. 3 architectural episodes, or scenes, are arranged sequentially along this axis, each as inconclusive as the one before it. And here are the 3 perspectives that correspond to these moments along the axis. As is made clear by Unger's 3-part perspective drawing here, the aesthetic references are to metaphysical painting and to surrealism, from De Chirico to Magritte. The first scene presents an empty forecourt populated by a De Chirico mannequin and spherical trees, the one at the top. The second presents a ramp leading from an empty street with diagrammatic facades through a series of squared-off archways, off of which are arranged gridded antechambers that serve as serve the galleries. And the third scene, a sculpture garden with cubic trees arranged in a grid, and large-scale sculptures poised abjectly in the niches on either side. Here, I just want to call your attention to one apparently minor detail in the plan, which is emphasized in these perspectives. Where the central axis, marked in the drawings by a hovering blimp, see the blimp? Expands into a space of passage in the first 2 scenes. In fact, you can occupy the axis, as is emphasized by the Magritte scale figure there. In the third one on the bottom, it contracts to the thinness of a line, marked by the central row of trees in the floating grid. And so this Magritte-like scale figure, who had first entered from the side and climbed up the central ramp, has now been shuffled off to the side again by the rather unaccommodating tree grid, and condemned to a degree of abjection equivalent to that's afforded to the reclining surrealist figure opposite, so being pushed off to the side. I emphasize this because Ungers could have accommodated the passage all the way through, the path all the way through, by utilizing a grid consisting of 4 rows of trees rather than 3. These are highly rhetorical grids, of course. But he did not, and he made a point of it in every detail of the drawing, including the blimp. Though Ungers' stated intentions emphasize placemaking, this is what he actually says about it, it's a series of places, the end result is that we are presented here with an enigmatic, allegorical subject of history in the form of the Magritte figure, who also turns out to be a self-portrait of the architect himself. A human whose centrality has been displaced in this architectural dream by an anachronistic, highly schematized dialectic of nature and culture. Trees, grids, and a blimp. So, in sharp contrast to whatever classical precedent on which Ungers' symmetries may have drawn, the humanist human, who had started out as the central character in the narrative of the democratic path, has, by the inconclusive end, been relegated to a supporting role. In this way, Ungers has effectively extended rather than interrupted the post-humanist tendencies of functionalism a la Mies, Gropius, and Hilberzheimer, with their serialities and their grids. He has not, in other words, deployed a more humane, well-proportioned, and hierarchical classicism against the indeterminate geometries of modernism, or their abstraction, but with them, extending the logic of the inhuman into what we can call the standing reserve of classicism itself, just as this pseudo-classical anti-axis emerges out of the gridded infrastructures of the museum, adjacent and below. So this is still a machine, however humane it may seem. Now, in case you're wondering where I'm going with all this talk about going nowhere, I want to pay now a brief visit to a house designed by an architect whose humanity, as well as that of his architecture, has gone largely unquestioned. That architect is Charles Moore, the self-appointed maker of places, in opposition to the non-places of modernism. A maker, in other words, of destinations, safe havens, or even homes, antidotes to what Georg Lukács had long ago called, with reference to modernity's upheavals, a transcendental homelessness. So this is the kind of antidote. The building that I want to visit here is actually a condominium complex that Moore designed in Los Angeles in 1978 for himself and two of his friends. Linguistically, to use a favorite metaphor of the day, it leans solidly toward the eclectic, that supposed hallmark of postmodernism, kind of eclectic pastiche, with its awkward combination of vernacular, regional, and even high modernist references. While on the interiors, the three units are simultaneously sort of woven together and separated by a sequence of irregular stairways. You can see them working their way through the plans, along which fragments of space are distributed to the left and to the right, but also above and below. Where do these stairways lead? Again, they lead nowhere in particular, but with great precision. Don't underestimate Charles Moore. As such, they exemplify Moore's predilection for what he called leaky space, interior space that breaks open in unsystematic ways, often to allow light in through irregular cracks or diagonal views, or apparently ad hoc functional connections. As realized even at a small scale in Moore's houses, such space has been called Piranesian. Though at first glance this would appear to be a domesticated Piranesi, especially in view of the quaint incrustations of bric-a-brac with which Moore habitually adorned it. But something of the sinister Piranesian sublime does remain nonetheless, I think. Not so much in the fragmentation of interior space, but rather in the frustration brought on by the various fragmented passages up and through this space, as they fail to connect up in any cognitively transparent way, much like the various archways and bridges to nowhere in Piranesi's prison etchings. So it really just doesn't make sense. To be sure, unlike the civic drama played out in the public spaces of a museum, there is no self-evident reason why the circulation of a house should lead anywhere in particular. But you can be equally sure that the erudite Moore was well aware of the history of the Promenade Architecturale when he was designing his houses, including its heroic iterations in Le Corbusier's domestic architecture, like the Villa Savoye. Indeed, unlike the examples we've just encountered with Stirling and with Ungers, Moore's irregular stairways and passages cannot even convincingly be said to correspond to discrete episodes in an inconclusive architectural narrative. They are, in a sense, pure events, one after the other. A pastiche, not so much of architectural styles, but of the notion of historical progress itself. It's sort of as if they're going somewhere. Moore's little domestic episodes are events that occur outside of the time and space of any narrative whatsoever, despite or perhaps even because of the various architectural histories to which they and their enclosing volumes refer. So in architectural terms, the bad copies of historical elements visible in these examples matter less than the way in which they are assembled, especially as in the case of Moore, when the attempt is to produce the effect of casual juxtaposition. The effect, in other words, of pastiche itself. In all three of these cases, Stirling, Ungers, and Moore, the architectural element called circulation is the means by which this is achieved. And the fact that the supposed narratives played out along the way say almost nothing about architecture's relationship to its own histories, whether past, present, or future, does seem to suggest that this architecture has been content to exchange the utopian master narratives of modernism for any number of inconclusive, episodic, and non-committal micro-narratives that add up exactly to nothing. But what if it's the other way around? What if, in direct contradiction to the claims made by so many protagonists on all sides of the postmodern debates in architecture, there is something specifically and helplessly utopian about this failure to add up? Now, I don't mean this in the sense of a conciliatory pluralism, a sort of happy pluralism in which each competing micro-narrative and each competing style, this is sort of Jenks's model, is given equal time and space, like products on a supermarket shelf. I mean it in the sense of a project that refuses to take the form of a project, a kind of inadvertent or accidental project that appears indirectly in an almost unrecognizable return of the repressed. For if we were truly and fully postmodern, we would not experience even a twinge of frustration when confronted by the failure of these built-in architectural narratives to add up. But we do, or at least I think we do, or I hope you do. Why? Well, because in staging various forms of frustration or exhaustion, they also cannot help but to stage its antithesis, the forever deferred possibility of arrival, of a break, of irreversible and maybe even revolutionary historical change. In that sense, these frustrated passages, which might also be seen as ghosts of the arcaded, phantasmagoric passages of 19th century Europe explored by Walter Benjamin, these passages might still harbor, despite themselves, what Benjamin called a weak messianic power. It's just that the changes they announce look different than what we might have thought. Or to put it another way, we are no longer able to recognize ourselves or our histories in them. Now, I hope that you'll indulge me when I suggest that as a result, one name that we have to give to such ghostly representations of world historical change, driving and driven by a humanity that may no longer be human, is simply architecture, or architecture really with a capital A. For if these frustrated architectural passages lead anywhere, it's back to the stage set, to its props and to the visor effect. That is, they lead back inside, to architecture and only architecture, or to what Tafuri melancholically described as a Piranesian prison house of linguistic play to which a non-redemptive, autonomous architecture as such was thenceforth supposedly condemned. So what happens when you sort of double back on architecture? Well, consider, for example, another Unger's museum, which is this time a museum of architecture itself, the Deutsches Architekturmuseum in Frankfurt of 1984. Here, Ungers inserts his little type forms into an existing 19th century villa. You can see it in cutaway here. Alternating, as he did in Cologne, between an emphasis on the gridded matrix and on the figural pavilions that fit one within the other, in a cascade of houses within houses or architecture within architecture. This is the as-built version of the project, and I have to say the original, I think, is much more compelling in this regard. By the mid-1980s, the archetypal house form, polemically stated by Venturi in his Mother's House of 1964, was well established as a cipher for architecture as such, and had already been set off into a kind of mise en abîme, a kind of cascade, an abyss by Moore, in this house within a house that he designed for himself in 1962. Here you can see the drawing that shows one thing within the other and the other. And so it would have seemed entirely appropriate for Ungers to put the house form on display, as it were, in an architecture museum, even as he used it as scaffolding for the museum's exhibits down below. But as before, the actual architecture that he designed abounds with ambiguities. Central among these is the ghostliness of the archetypal house itself and in its multiple iterations. Perhaps a distant relative of Venturi's own rather literally ghosted house museum for Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia in 1976, this museum house, Ungers' museum house, is, strictly speaking, haunted. First, it's haunted in the conventional sense that we might attribute to a project like Aldo Rossi's Monument to the Partisans at Zegrate in 1965, which makes an even starker use of the triangular archetype in the form of an abstracted extruded pediment. As with all museums, there's something funerary and commemorative about Ungers' project, which, like Rossi's work more generally, can be thought to be dedicated not to architecture as such, but to its memory. But this house museum is also haunted in another more complex sense. In the perspectives that Ungers produced for the original scheme, and less so in the version that was finally built, the building is haunted by the city on which it turns its back. It sort of turns in on itself. As manifest in its own self-referential emptiness, the building also remembers and, in a sense, mourns a collective future from which the entire assemblage now recoils, looking inward rather than outward. Such claustrophobia repeats in other Ungers projects, including the Hotel Berlin competition entry of 1980 with its buildings within buildings sequence that pauses on the interior at a little atrium-like glass house and on the exterior at a relentless extrusion of the typical Berlin perimeter block. The hotel's nested topologies bring to mind the disorienting nested interiors of John Portman's Bonaventure Hotel in Los Angeles, which Jameson has famously read as a diagram of nothing less than postmodern space. In response to such disorientations, Jameson called for new cognitive maps to navigate the labyrinths of late capitalism, and surely he was right. But we also need new forms of projection leading to an exit from such spaces. And here, rather than projecting outward from architecture to the city to the world, we might seek these proto-utopian exits deep inside our architectural nightmares. Built-in trapdoors concealed in the architecture itself that, like visors, open onto other possible worlds rather than onto one more solipsistic prison cell to which one is forever condemned like a Russian doll. And so, as we segue into the concluding sequence of projects, it's not surprising to find Ungers, in collaboration with Rem Koolhaas no less, and with Hans Koloff, as well as with a group of architecture students from Cornell, trying out his topological cascades in 1977 in a project for the reurbanization of West Berlin, which even then was a shrinking city. Titled Cities Within the City, the project proposed that a green archipelago of, I'm going to go through the sequence of drawings, green archipelago of park-like islands be extracted out of the existing fabric as a way to deal with the city's depopulation. This arrangement would be punctuated by an equivalent archipelago of built islands, modeled on precedents as diverse as the radial plan of Karlsruhe and Ivan Leonidov's linear city design for Magnitogorsk. To mediate between these urban scale insertions and the scale of the individual building, and to counter the persistent tendency of residents to prefer the individuality of detached houses to the anonymity of large apartment blocks, the urban villa, shown here, a kind of detached collective dwelling made up of 4 to 8 units, was proposed as a prototypical residential building. Now, both Ungers and Koolhaas had already been exploring this proposition in their own work. Koolhaas, in his reading of the Manhattan grid as an infrastructure that supported individual expression in each of its blocks, diagrammed by his colleague Zoe Zengelis as a museum of architectural history in the city of the captive globe in 1972. And Ungers in such projects as his competition entry for a housing complex in Marburg in 1976, in which the urban villa prototype was projected onto an entire city block, broken down into 5 little residential units, each given their own distinctly architectural form, in recognition of the desire for variety and individuality on the part of the new consumers for whom the project was designed, again in West Germany. At the level of its polycentric urban organization, the cities within a city, or in the case of West Berlin, islands within an island model, recognized and sought to reinforce certain characteristics that were emerging in post-industrial cities across the northern transatlantic in response to the decentralizing pressures of suburbanization. The resulting archipelago, with its attempt to maintain in its components as wide an architectural spectrum as possible, was offered not as a utopia, but as a conciliatory anti-utopia, or, as its authors put it, as an improvement of what was already there. Proposed, as were so many modernist utopias before it, as a scientific solution to objective problems, the project was published with the following comment. This is Koolhaas, Ungers, and company. Quote, "There is no need for a new utopia, but rather to create a better reality," end quote. Interestingly enough, Jameson too has suggested that the political model of a federated archipelago might offer a map capable of grasping and to some extent managing the multiple displacements of postmodernism and, by extension, globalization. He offers Yona Friedman's Utopie réalisable, or Realizable Utopias of 1975 as an example, with its proposal for a multitude of non-communicating communities, or an archipelago of autonomous islands wrapping the globe and linked by a shared infrastructure, where it is the inalienable right of every inhabitant of every island to leave their homeland behind and migrate. A proposal like Friedman's, and to a lesser extent this Ungers Koolhaas project for Berlin, where of course no such open borders existed, seems at first to have the virtue of acknowledging the multiple and conflicting identities and desires of its subjects, the inhabitants of metropolitan West Berlin, who had been treated as standardized stereotypes by earlier generations of architects and planners, by essentially refracting the little island called Utopia itself into a multitude of little utopias, many little islands rather than just one. That Karlsruhe and Magnitogorsk were chosen as models further suggests that despite the contentions of the plan's authors, Utopia's ghost had hardly been exorcised by the supposed realism of their plan. Instead, it had multiplied into all these little gated communities, essentially. But this multiplicity, this splitting of the ghost into a ghostly multitude, is not without its own problems. Taken to a logical conclusion, and without the architecture of the urban villa as a semi-collective stopgap, it finally gives in to the atomization and fragmentation of the entire post-industrial consumerist landscape by imagining a series of individual private futures in place of a single collective one. Or, in another possible extension, it risks simply replacing the homogenizing universalism that guided earlier efforts to build for the stereotyped masses with a logic of diversified enclaves that rapidly begin to resemble the neighborhood or other forms of supposedly local, organic, and eventually gated community, to say nothing of their accompanying archipelagos of exception a la Agamben. Nevertheless, in its refraction, in its splitting up, Utopia's ghost has also managed here to preserve something of its otherworldliness, its sense of being nowhere, to the extent that now nowhere is to be found almost everywhere, though in a different form in each case. Now, in conclusion, to conclude, allow me to explain by way of a negative example, as I attempt to double back on the positive consequences implied by this state of affairs. In the late 1970s, at around the same time that many of the works I've just discussed were being designed and or built, three cities, Brussels, Strasbourg, and Luxembourg, were being considered for the parliamentary seat of the European Union, which would hold its first direct election in 1979. So again, globalization is sort of hovering in the background. The French architect Roger Tahibert was therefore commissioned to produce a plan for Luxembourg that integrated the new institutions into the city center. This project here, called Center 300, was presented to the public in February 1978 amid a sense of urgency that it be swiftly approved in order to be realized by 1979 in time for the elections. This is essentially Luxembourg's bid for the EU sort of prize. It consisted of a Brasilia-like platform on which the new monuments would sit, poised like very large abstract sculptures, ready to accept the organs of the new European legislative body. Also in 1978, the Luxembourgian architect Léon Krier prepared a counter-project in response. Here again was the city within a city archipelago model, though this time in the form of what Krier called the city as a federation of quarters, which you see here, or pedestrian-scaled neighborhoods in the form of reconstructed streets flanked by a pseudo-vernacular, low-rise, mixed-use urban fabric and punctuated by neoclassical monuments. This is Krier's Ostland proposal for the Parliament, the European Parliament. The plan's ideal imagined subject was neither an industrial worker nor a post-industrial manager, but rather a pre-industrial and strictly European artisan. In other words, a human, who lived down the block from where he worked. Thus, in many ways, Krier is the most rigorously utopian of the many architects commonly designated as postmodern. But I want to suggest that Krier's manifest and unmediated utopianism, pure as it may be, works, on the contrary, to exorcise, to chase out, rather than to conjure, the many ghosts of utopia that we have been tracking in other works from this period. For in proposing what he calls a city of stone, to counter the willfulness and the artificiality of the city of concrete, steel, and glass, Krier the exorcist attempts a revivification, a bringing back to life of a humanity, in other words, Europe, whose organic unity can only be obtained through the deaths of others. A nostalgia for modernity's ultimate lost object, the home, or in this case, the homeland, at the very moment of its deterritorialization into the so-called New Europe of post-colonial migrations. This nostalgia runs so deep in his architecture as to force a comparison with the terrifying nostalgia for a non-existent, glorious past brought back to life in the work of Albert Speer, an architect whose reputation Krier has been singularly devoted to rehabilitating. In contrast, like Georg Zimmel's Metropolitan Stranger, ghosts are effectively homeless. That is, they are of a place only in the sense of returning to haunt it without ever quite fitting in. And so it is here, of all places, in the heart of old Europe as it reorganizes itself in response to what we now call globalization, that Krier's xenophobic project puts the question in the starkest terms possible. Cosmopolitanism or provincialism? An as yet unrealized openness to strangers, or a purified European humanity built in stone? Learning to live with ghosts. The phrase is Derrida's, but it designates a task worthy of any thought that seeks to escape from the self-imposed impasse that used to be called postmodernism. There are many other examples of haunted urban islands that point in this direction. Cities within cities, such as Aldo Rossi's San Cataldo Cemetery at Modena, or John Haydock's Berlin Mask, or indeed his Lancaster Hanover Mask. Despite their pseudo-humanist attempts to restore meaning, these and other projects may finally mark an end to that enterprise that wanted desperately to link architecture to the city and thereby to society, that is so beautifully summarized by Leon Battista Alberti in his dictum, "The city is like some large house, and the house is in turn like some small city." Cut off from the city like an isolated house on a deserted street on a deserted island, these enclosures seem only to converge on architecture with a capital A, autonomous and useless. But inside, we might be surprised to find that same street leading back to that same house. In short, an entire city and an entire world, refracted through the minutest details, through the minutest of details, like the turn of a corner or the modulation of a grid. Such objects may therefore seem to build nothing more than a hall of mirrors from which there is no escape. But in this realm of materialized spirits also lurks the potential for a new kind of project, in which the specter that once haunted Europe finally goes global. By this, in this case, I mean a strictly architectural project, a form of architectural thought that neither attempts narcissistically to render its own pasts present, nor mourns their passing. Instead, in looking back, it reorients its gaze towards futures yet to come. It does this by probing its own claustrophobic interiority, its many histories, not as some kind of defeat, but in search of a topological reversal, where the further inside you go, the further outside you get. And with such a turning of the tables, history itself, far from having come to an end, would turn and return in the kind of feedback loops of a slightly offset periodicity in which where we are going is never exactly where we have been. Caught in these loops, we may eventually realize that if the post in postmodernism means anything, it means learning to live with ghosts, including the ghosts of futures past and present, the ghosts of others, alive and dead, and with them, the ghosts of our former selves. It means, in other words, learning to think the thought called utopia once again. Thank you. questions I suppose we must ask.
You have made a constant remark to identify Utopia not as not as an ideological construction, but as a discursive element. And I think that's a very important shift, also in the way that you talk about postmodernism not as an ideology, but as a discursive practice. Could you comment a bit more on that?
Yeah, that's a nice question to sort of try to elaborate on this, because I mean, to be honest, a lot of this does sort of come from sort of an observation that it's impossible to say a word like utopia seriously in architecture schools today, and be taken seriously. That's what discourse is. It's like it's censorship essentially. It's a sort of saying you're not allowed to think that thought anymore, because that thought has led to all kinds of catastrophes, pruitt-igo, and so on, and therefore we really have to humanize the whole thing and go from there. Now, so I'm interested in in how does that work, and how that actually works, and how you learn not to think. This process of it, in effect, unthinking something. And of course, looking for, let's say, mechanisms to reintroduce that thought, but not in the same manner, not in a nostalgic or sort of naive sense, but really in a strategic sense. Because that's the other thing that discourses, in effect, demand. They demand strategies, of intervention, kind of like your points about agency, looking for points of intervention. And I think that the kind of opening with the IBM image, think, the corporations are telling you to think. Already in 1915, corporations are saying think. So they're in your head, this is what kind of, late capitalism is. And so strategically, we have to learn to think in a different way. And if you, in a way, shape, or form, think that things should be different or object to some of the consequences of this. And so there's a kind of strategic element to it. And another element of it is really kind of almost empirical or historical, is that to say, how did this happen? How did we arrive at this kind of situation in which students, I don't know, students, my students, surely, we discussed these things in seminars, felt that they were not allowed to imagine the world differently. Not by their teachers, but by the world in which they lived. They were simply, it was just off the table as a discursive option. And the thing is, you can't really just force that back on. You have to sort of understand why it's off the table and under what conditions. And this is a little bit of a story about how recent that thought is, because the historical claim is usually that postmodernism killed it off, and I'm effectively saying no. In fact, postmodernism didn't kill off utopia. What came after postmodernism killed off utopia. That's the sort of techno-euphoria of the new economy and all that. That killed the stuff that looks utopian is what killed utopia. In my, if you follow this. So it's like you have to learn to think sort of upside down and inside out in all kinds of bizarre ways. Anyway, so that makes sense.
No, but just building on that, if we would in a certain way quote Fourier's sublime uselessness.
Yeah.
Looking into many of the projects that were not necessarily only technocratic in their appearance, but in some of the postmodern architecture. I see in your work much more not of a reclamation of the territory of postmodernism as a container of utopia, but again as a discursive manner to be able to name the word utopia without blame.
Yeah, you can take here's another more practical one that I've been actually, honestly, to put a little plug, at the Buell Center, we're working on this. Buell Center is a research center at Columbia that I direct, and we're trying to work on this problem in the context of the new, Obama administration and everything like this, to ask, why is it that we haven't been allowed, in this country particularly, to say the word public in public, since the 80s, 70s? And especially when you speak about things like public housing, you have to say public-private, you have to say affordable, you're not allowed to say public housing. And the answer is very simple, pruitt-igo. that's, I mean, in a sort of, let's say, rhetorical sense, but in a very real one also. And all the narratives, out of which Obama himself comes. So there's a lot, a lot of work. I mean, I really mean like a lot of work at a very philosophical level, kind of the level that I'm, a lot of this is pitched, but also at a very kind of close to the ground. Like, you're allowed to talk about public housing. Do you know that? You're allowed to imagine that. You're allowed to do a project that says this is a public housing project. It's funded by the state. People live there who can't afford to live anywhere else. And, and so on and so on and so on. Of course, not that simple, right? But, it's a kind of analogous sort of strategy.
How was, you ended up with probing interiority
Yeah.
a new field. Can you say why probing interiority is the...
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. Yeah, right. Why would you do that?
Is the place where one overcomes the prohibitions that have been placed on all these things?
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, you could see that as a strategic suggestion or hypothesis, let's say, that it's a little bit counterintuitive, right? That in order to try to escape from the Hall of Mirrors, from the sort of, escape from the Bonaventure Hotel, you look for the door. Like, where's the door? How do I get out? And then you look outside, and a lot of work has been done, and a lot of very important work has been done, to extend the horizons, extend the scope of the field that we call architecture, to sort of literally to break open this sort of little box that Aldo Rossi was stuck in, and that the word autonomy is usually used to refer to, to take into all sorts of other kinds of practices, to so-called alternative practices and other ones, to operate in a political economic field that seems otherwise off limits. There are all kinds of practices and strategies along those lines. But I want to suggest that actually simply going outwards, that actually, it's not at all refusing that. It's simply, it's really only half the story, because to understand how you actually got to this point was not a withdrawal. That's kind of the point. Autonomy was not a withdrawal. It wasn't a la Tafuri, sitting in the living room listening to the fables of the grannies. That's what he famously said about these. It was actually a kind of war game. And it's delayed. Its effects are delayed. But you don't get the Guggenheim. You don't get signature architecture. You don't get all of these sort of meta effects. You don't get Abu Dhabi without autonomy. One is a precondition for the other. So if you want to work on Abu Dhabi, if you're sort of say that's a problem, then you have to, in a sense, go back, in my view, to autonomy as well as to the sort of broader urban field as a kind of site for investigation and for critique. So architecture, another way of saying this is that architecture, understood in its traditional kind of art form sort of sense, actually offers us more critical tools than we think. We've been a little bit, I think.
So it's a doorway into the autonomous project.
It's like a trap door.
This escape is really into the autonomous project, which is far richer than we've imagined it in the last 20 years.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I wouldn't say go ahead and design autonomous architecture, something like that. It's just that the kind of idea that architecture is separated out from the world, right? That's the story that was told since the 70s as a way to kind of defend against many things. To defend against behavioralism, to defend against the market, to defend against, environmental design and all those other kinds of practices. That story is false. The turning inward, there's sort of like a trap door in there, and inside, in that prison house, as Deferred, there is the world. There is a world, and you sort of come out the other side into globalization. It's a kind of mental topology that I'm trying to suggest. Needs to be kind of grasped in order to take full measure, let's say, of architecture's status and leverage also within this sort of complex of forces.
But it seems to sort of reverberate with the archipelago model that you so well described in the Berlin project, where Utopia is divided up into multiple utopias. Any utopia is relativistic. No one's no better than the other.
Right.
Democratic utopias.
Right.
the sort of turning inward seems to adopt that model.
Well, that is kind of where it ends up. I mean,
But maybe that model's the trap as well. The archipelago.
Yeah. Oh, I totally. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So but it seems like you're perpetuating it when you're talking about an inwardness.
Yeah. No, I'm not trying to argue for the archipelago model. I'm just saying if you know, I mean, on the one hand, it's a cognitive model. It's like, you know, that's what cities are becoming today in all kinds of ways. So, you know, so where Koolhaas in effect, you know, I mean, this is early Koolhaas, among other things, you know, has developed an entire, like bigness, I think, would be a stage in this development theoretically. It's just a reinforcement, a reproduction. It's like a mirror of what's actually happening out there in, you know, the world of gated communities and everything else. But I think Ungers is maybe a more interesting figure than is generally assumed. I think in the States, particularly since Cornell and the kind of Cornell formalism sort of went its way, the Ungers has sort of been forgotten a bit, and there is a kind of pathos. I mean, see, what I'm getting at really is, and I think it's also somewhat generationally true. It's biographically true even, that this is a generation of architects who remember modernism and are haunted by it. They're troubled by the problem. So it's as if they go into the laboratory of architecture and just start, okay, we're not going to deal with that anymore. We're going to just do architecture, you know, and we're going to do the poetics and, you know, classicism, all those things, grids. But then they discover, without knowing it, or they didn't discover this, but I'm trying to suggest that this is what happened, is that they were actually working on the Manhattan Project, effectively. I mean, you know, in other words, by going inside, into the laboratory, scientifically studying architecture as an autonomous project, what you actually wind up doing is refining the basis, the raw materials, the sort of substance, out of which the next stage is being sort of, you know, prepared. So, you know, and that stage is, among other things, signature architecture, because, you know, you have to be able to account for the fact somehow that what we call globalization has turned the architect not into an irrelevant sort of category a la Koolhaas. He keeps saying that, but it's not true. It's turned the architect into a fetish, into a kind of like museum piece. So, you know, this is another way. So then there's probably some leverage in there. You know, that's what I'm saying. Or there is some leverage in there. Have we exhausted them?
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.